Well, looks like it's official now. Formula One has confirmed that we will have 22 cars on the grid once more for the first time in a decade. And even though the official statements chose to overlook that fact on F1.com, it's gotten a little bit more complicated. But I think that the main point of discussion that many of you out there might have is, who's going to be driving for them? Could this be Checo's salvation, perhaps? Now, for those reckoning this is just yet another rumour without the actual backing of General Motors, think again. This is all coming from the proper channels, F1's own website, as well as General Motors' own website. They are really celebrating this. It's going to be an operation that is going to be spanning many different facilities, which does fill me with a little bit of concern that it might be spread too thin over multiple sites. But either way, there are going to be multiple bases, including Silverstone, and this is taking on all of the stuff that Andretti and their operation have been building on since the FI put out their expression of interest nearly 2 years ago. Has this been dragging on 2 years? This is ridiculous. But in my honest opinion, I feel like General Motors preferred to do all this in the background and let Andretti kind of lead the charge, but since Liberty Media and Formula One management chose to drag their heels as well as all the team principals, the behemoth that is GM basically just rolled up their sleeves and pulled the Thanos by just going, fine, I'll do it myself. In my honest opinion, F1 had no choice but to get this deal with General Motors across the line, because the integrity of the Audi entry that they lauded just a couple of years ago, well, that's kind of looking questionable. It's a completely different beast to what it was back then. Seriously, do you remember just a couple of years ago when Audi was coming in and F1 was cheering, absolutely jubilant with the fact that this huge German automaker was coming to Formula One in 2026? It's completely different now. People have come and gone. Audi's been questioned whether or not it's even committed. They've constantly pushed back, saying that they are. The CEO and leaders of the group have changed so many times. Sauber is where it is right now, and it's right at the back. No one's quite sure how competitive Audi will be. Although I do think Matteo Binotto's influence in terms of the power unit and his engine expertise might give them a little bit of a sporting chance. But the fact is, though, the ownership of this team has changed so much. And after Audi took 100% control and it looked like they were really taking it seriously, now that's being brought into doubt again for the fact that now the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund is taking a minority stake of it and potentially could easily buy it out. And who knows where they might be in a few years' time. They might sell it entirely before the engine regulations change in 2030. And then you've got the likes of Alpine dropping its own engines to maintain Mercedes supplying 4 teams, and thusly bringing their own future into question, with Renault taking a back seat, not even supplying power units anymore to them or other teams. And even though Team Enstone has proven its resilience over the years that they can weather pretty much any single storm that any big entity out there can throw at them, this is still a very major cause for concern. A storied team, their future being brought into question, and no one quite sure where it's going to end up. And you then look to General Motors and their bid and their backing. It looks a lot more solid, and it really does appeal to the American itch that Formula One Liberty Media really wants to scratch. And this is such a simple task, Formula One. Just sign this 11th team, backed by General Motors. You're guaranteed to get a really popular reaction, and many people out there have been cheering. But let's be real. Liberty Media was looking at 2 of their teams for 2026. They looked a little bit dubious, and General Motors was over there. They pretty much were over a barrel. And you do have to admire the resolve and resourcefulness of the Andretti-backed project, that despite the absolutely damning rejection Formula One management threw in their direction back in January, they kept going regardless, with the leadership and stubbornness of Michael and Mario Andretti inspiring them in their mission. And I also believe that General Motors were irked as well, because this was almost a judge of their own character and their integrity, because it meant that they basically had to get a lot more involved earlier than they would have liked. Because regardless of the whole Andretti thing, they're coming in with Cadillac-badged power units for 2028. I think they would have preferred to be able to just go softly and quietly understand how Formula One worked in the shadows without having to get too involved, and therefore they could have a really good understanding without being rushed. And speaking of, who is actually going to be providing them with power units, since Cadillac won't be ready until 2028, which would be their 3rd season of competition if the 2026 deal goes ahead? Well, I was thinking about all those rumours that were going around that maybe they might have bought out the Renault operation from Ville Chatillon and give those people a bit of a job, but no, it turns out it's going to be Ferrari supplying them. And this does make sense, since Ferrari would be down a customer if this didn't go ahead when Audi takes over with their own power unit, and this would be ending a relationship with the Swiss-based team that has been around since the mid-90s, save for a temporary blip with BMW when they were their owners. Also, I think it's actually quite poignant, a nice little narrative story, because the Andretti-backed team, although the Andrettis have taken a back seat, with Ferrari, it's a nice little nod to the times when Mario Andretti himself was racing in red for the Scuderia. You might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Mario Andretti didn't drive for Ferrari. Well, he did, albeit at different stages in his career and for not an entire season. And yes, he did secure his 1978 F1 championship with Lotus and is more better known for driving with Colin Chapman's team. But he did win a couple of races with the Scuderia back in his day, including, I think, the South African Grand Prix one year. And he also secured a really, really emotional podium at Monza in the 1982 Italian Grand Prix when he was a super sub during the time when Didier Pironi had been severely injured at Hockenheim, so he came in clutch at a time when they needed him, and it was the last time he secured a Formula One podium and points and pole position. He really did sing at that race. So the Tifosi do remember Mario fondly, so to have this connection, albeit a little bit tedious and tenuous and probably had nothing to do with the actual deal, because I think Ferrari still wanted some customer money as well as research and development for at least another couple of years, I think it's nice. I think it's poignant. And speaking of the Andrettis, do they play any part in all of this going forward? Well, I think yes and no, but mostly no with a but. Even though Michael Andretti is squarely out of the picture when it comes to high-level discussions regarding his own team, his father Mario has been spared the chop to some extent, and he'll now serve as a director in the team's board, albeit in a non-executive capacity, not really involved in the day-to-day operations. But he's happy with this outcome, and he's now having to pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. I think they will consider this a moral victory over the behemoth that is Liberty Media and Greg Maffei, who is also stepping down as the CEO and head of the legal board of the operation. This was a case of them being able to weather that storm, they didn't give up, and now they've actually gotten this entity, as well as all the people that they've hired, to be able to compete in Formula One at the highest level of motorsport. They will be proud of this, and Mario himself is proud that after all of this time in motorsport, in racing, and having been an F1 driver, he can now be some part of a team that may or may not have his name on it, although at the moment, and I'll talk more about this later, it might not be carrying its name. It might be more like Cadillac Racing or something like that, at least for now. But one thing I find really, really interesting in all of this is that the resistance towards this entry has just miraculously disappeared throughout the entire Las Vegas weekend. When asked about it, all of the major team principals either were quite welcoming of General Motors or they had no opinion at all, and that it was mainly up to the FIA, Formula One management and the team themselves to actually get this deal across the line, whereas for the longest time they were constantly having an opinion about Andretti and General Motors and questioning it, and actually vehemently saying that they should not be allowed and that their precious prize money might be compromised, as well as their own integrity in the sport, and they might have to look elsewhere. So yeah, just look at that, and it's completely changed. It's so bizarre. But when you think that the Department of Justice investigation still exists, it's still ongoing and has been since the summer, this might actually explain some things. And according to GrandPrix.com, a trusted source of theirs claims that as part of this investigation, key figures within F1 were interviewed by US authorities, which did include Toto Wolff and Stefano Domenicali, the F1 CEO. Which might explain why the rumours circulated that he might have made a move to run MotoGP now that Liberty Media is starting to acquire it, and they were since quashed, but it was an interesting coincidence. Maybe if he had no choice, but as part of this deal, he would have to step down as the CEO of Formula One management, Liberty Media, instead of allowing him to move on to other projects outside of motorsport, they could then just say, oh no, he's just moving over to this other sport, this other motorsport that we own, so there'd be no change in his day-to-day running. So this would explain why the rumour even came about, but now it's not happening. He is very much going to be remaining the F1 CEO. The timing of this all, what they said in the Vegas press conferences to official media, that is still very intriguing, that this sudden climb down even happened. So okay, who runs Andretti Global now that Michael Andretti has backed off somewhat? Well, that would be the likes of Dan Taurus. He a close partner of the Andrettis in their IndyCar campaign, and he himself is a representative of the family investment firm TWG Global, who I never heard of until just now while I was making this video. And they've actually got a few fingers in a few motorsport pies, including in IMSA, as well as being, randomly, the owners of the LA Dodgers baseball team. Now you might be thinking, oh, this is just another firm buying out the Andretti firm and trying to milk what they have already worked on. Well, no. Taurus and Andretti, they've been working for a little while, since before the Andrettis decided to get into Formula One when the FIA put out their expression of interest. So they've worked together for a while, and they are very closely linked in the IndyCar campaign. So I do think there is something more to this, and that ultimately the Andrettis will have some sort of influence, albeit with a different guy in the chair. So maybe him being in charge of discussions with Dominicale and Greg Maffei and John Malone, who is taking over from Maffei, maybe this might be just some ways of trying to get this deal over the line, so that means they can get racing, and that maybe this could lead to the Andretti name eventually returning once General Motors gets their power unit ready to go for 2028. And it would be really funny, wouldn't it? You know, Andretti actually getting the last laugh, and that the name actually comes back once the team's already established, so that means they can't be kicked out because of it. Yeah, I would be really, really smug if that happened, but for the time being, I don't think we can really discuss this. I think it's really going to be called Cadillac Racing, or, well, Cadillac Racing Ferrari, and then one of their major sponsors is going to be Gamebridge, considering that Taurus owns Group 1001, and that they have the Gamebridge name in their wheelhouse. But having said that, maybe General Motors might want to leverage the Andretti name somewhat, now they're actually gaining some traction in IndyCar again, but I think ultimately they might decide to want to make the most of the fact that Cadillac is really getting a name for itself in high-end motorsport, and Formula One would be the jewel in the crown, the icing on the cake, and having General Motors there alongside Ford, they would want to be shouting that loud and proud to make it clear that Ford's got some competition from America, and that in itself is going to be a really interesting and cool narrative to see which one of those outfits actually wins after they've gotten themselves running for a few years. Then the question is about something that is quite fundamental in F1. Is this team going to be any good? Well, now that I know that Ferrari will be providing them power units for a couple of years until they get on their feet, I do feel a little bit more confident in terms of their prospects. And sure, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, Sauber's got Ferrari power units and look where they are. This is just going to lead to them being last as well. Well, hold on. If you look at many of the speed tracks throughout the entire season, Sauber are not dead last. In some cases, they actually end up being the fastest when you get a low downforce configuration. That Ferrari power unit is not slow. It's just everything else in that Sauber car is slow, which is not helping their cause. And also, this isn't the old Sauber days where they were happily accepting year-old Ferrari cast-offs as their power units. No, the engines that Cadillac will be getting for 2026 and 2027, they'll be the same that the Scuderia used, albeit probably not as well optimized, nor will they get probably the creme de la creme in terms of specification, because Ferrari, understandably, would want to have the best power units that they make. Also, you've got to take into account all the stuff that Andretti has been talking about, in public by the way, in terms of their development and their progress, and the achievements and milestones they've been able to actually gain. Because, let's be real, over the last couple of years, Andretti have not exactly been quiet as to how things have been going with their F1 efforts. They've been shouting from the rooftops every single time they have managed to get something really big that will actually increase their chances of getting into F1 and having a stable foothold. And that's probably not helped them in terms of their campaign. It's probably, made all of the current F1 teams look really down on them as they're actually sharing how crass of them. But it's still something to consider, because all of this, I think, will lead to them not being subject to the 107% rule at all. All the stuff that they and General Motors have been working on, I think this will lead to something quite competent. Sure, other teams might have had years to think about the 2026 rules, but they are still yet to be fully locked in just weeks before teams can start working on them again at full pace. Because let's remember, the embargo that was imposed and will be lifted after New Year's Day in 2025 was mainly there to make sure that costs didn't spiral and the bigger teams didn't get some kind of advantage because they could plow many more resources into 2026 and leave some of the smaller teams out for dust. But there is something to consider as well at the same time, that throughout all of this, all the objections, the resistance, and with the Andretti's continuing at pace, which they said many times, I really do think, as well as many other journalists, that there might be something to this effort because they've been able to develop the 2026 rules because they were approved by the FIA, so therefore they would be privy to how the regulations for 2026 are changing, so they can actually respond in real time. This could lead to a car which is actually kind of okay. They've not been bound by the New Year's Day embargo, nor the cost cap, since technically they are not competing as an F1 team, but they will do in a couple of years, and yes, there could be more things added to the rules and taken away, which might be a setback for them, but this is something that will be meaning that they are on a level playing field. And as we know already, The outfit's been using the Toyota wind tunnel in Cologne for several months, and they've claimed that they will have a fully prepared 2026 spec chassis to test imminently that will be valuable for their development, especially now they've been given the green light for competition in Melbourne 2026. Now, understandably, you've got to be then taking into consideration the deal that Toyota has struck with Haas with the Gazoo racing outfit of Toyota, that maybe they might get more preferential treatment and first dibs of the wind tunnel, and that Andretti and Cadillac and General Motors might have to take a back seat, or they may not be able to understand all of the secrets that Toyota has been keeping, secret. But either way, this wind tunnel is still a really, really good one, and when it was built by Toyota themselves in the 2000s, it was a state-of-the-art facility. And it just makes me sad that Toyota pulled the plug just hours after the 2009 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix was finished, because the 2010 car, apparently to the ones who were building it, was looking like a really solid competitor. But maybe Toyota was done with having a solid competitor. They wanted wins and podiums consistently, and they weren't getting it. So in my honest opinion, I reckon that this General Motors back team will turn out to be a midfield entity at the beginning, capable of scoring points fairly regularly, but I doubt it can trouble the podium or the front-running staples of F1 unless they found something in the 2026 rules in their own time on the sidelines that other teams have not seen, and they might make advantage of it, at least for the opening races. The question is, though, is that whether or not this would lead to a Brawn GP-like operation where this advantage gets them some really good results in the few beginning races, but then they don't have the resources, capital, and expertise to be able to develop on top of it, and all the other teams will then find out what's going on, and if they then protest it and it turns out to be legal, they'll then copy it, they'll be able to innovate it even further, and then Andretti, General Motors, Cadillac, what have you, will be left for dust. But if General Motors do give them the resources and capitals in which to actually continue developing, then it might actually lead to something even better. So it's hard to predict, but I think it would be a safe bet to say that this team will end up being in the midfield, somewhere between 6th and 9th in the Constructors. Yes, that is a huge swathe of teams to consider here, but I think you have to be having some sort of broad estimate at the moment. It's far too early to actually think about something of a definite Constructors position, but somewhere between 6th and 9th in your first season of racing, beating a couple of current teams, that's still not bad. Yes, you've been patient, and I thank you for that patience, so I'll now be discussing who might be their drivers. Well, it depends. I've discussed this on my Blue Sky and Twitter profiles, the matter, and many people are looking to Colton Herta finally getting his chance and being the team's young upstart. Some did reckon that Alex Palouand might make the switch to F1 with Cadillac, since the bridges with McLaren were not only burnt, but they were pulverized, what with the ongoing case between the team and the driver. However, I really don't see this happening because at the moment, Palouand is 27 years old, and by the time this team will actually go racing, he'll be closer toward 30. Because you're seeing more and more these days that F1 drivers are arriving in the sport in their early 20s, sometimes even earlier than that, when they're only 18 or something like that. And even with Colton Herta, that is kind of pushing it, because he's currently 24, so he will have to hit the ground running when he does get the actual call-up, if he can actually succeed. And also, I think with Palouand at this point, he might want to consolidate what he's got in the American motorsport scene and maybe add some more IndyCar titles, maybe some more concerted efforts in terms of the Indy 500, because if he did go to F1, if he wanted to compete in Indy 500, he will have to take time away from that, so that'll be compromised. I think Palouand has missed the boat here, but I think he'll be okay with being a successful driver in the States. But as for Herta, I do recall he was talked about with AlphaTauri a while ago before De Vries got the call-up and then the call-out, but then people stopped talking about Herta after he had a couple of seasons of woeful performances, and his super license allocation dropped like a stone. However, that's now risen back to prominence again, because him getting second place in the IndyCar Championship, it got him a quite sizable load of points. Second place gets you 30 super license points in one go. And then you have to look back a couple of seasons. He's had a couple of 10th places. That gets you 1. So at the moment, he would have to secure 4th place in the 2025 IndyCar Championship to be sure he has enough super license points in which to compete in Formula 1. Otherwise, this group and team will have to find somebody else, or Herta might have to settle with being a reserve or something like that. But hey, if he can get a couple of FP1 sessions with a team, if they can broker a deal somewhat, then maybe if he has a couple of those and he gets over 100 kilometers of FP1 testing, then he can get a super license point for that, because that is the plum for getting an FP1 session. You get an extra super license point to your name. Then maybe he will only have to finish 5th, which might be somewhat doable. But hey, If Herta is on the trajectory and Andretti can provide him a car, which I'm pretty sure that now they definitely will, they'll give him the best of the best, then maybe F1 might be for him after all at the age of 25 or 26. I did think about Palouand Award for a second. Maybe Zach Brown could have brokered a deal with General Motors, and even though he's done quite a few FP1 sessions for McLaren, which will help his tally, at present he would need to be even more competitive next year. He'd have to win the title in Indy next year, or be second to get enough points to qualify for sure. Then it's a dead cert. They don't have a driver who is well known in America as one of their initial lineup, then it would kind of make them a bit of a laughing stock in a way. You need to have somebody from IndyCar as a bastion of the Formula One operation, at least in the first season. So Colton, I think that's a pretty logical person to have as one of their drivers. As for the other guy, well, they would want an experienced pair of hands next to Colton. I doubt that Cadillac would want to have two relative rookies to Formula One behind them in their first couple of seasons. I do hear Daniel Ricciardo down there. I hear it very loudly, but come on, he's over Formula One. It's been an emotional roller coaster for him as of late. I'm pretty sure that now he's looking to life after F1, either in a completely different racing series, I would personally say NASCAR ideally, or maybe looking at all of his entrepreneurial endeavors in terms of his clothes line as well as his drinks line. And my mind is really pointed toward one Sergio Perez perhaps, since his following would be most welcome with the American-based outfit, and he would have a wealth of knowledge from Red Bull when the times were good. But it depends whether or not Christian Horner would be willing to allow him to go to a team that is getting into F1, kind of like how Toto was concerned with Albon joining Williams, and considering that he might be a Red Bull spy. Considering that this is a General Motors back operation, would Christian Horner be willing to let that driver go who might know some of the machinations that's going on with Red Bull Ford and their powertrain operation? Giving the keys to this vital information, it depends how much Checo knows about this. I think at the moment, maybe it's not something that he needs to know because, well, it's not until 2026 and Checo might not even be there. But if this team is around and would be looking to Checo for at least a couple of seasons of experience before they can then maybe pick another driver, or if Checo chooses to retire on his own terms, this could be a really big boon. And let's not forget, Checo's major backer Carlos Slim is fervent and determined to make sure that Perez stays on the grid. And if there is a team that is willing to take him on, if Red Bull have had enough and all these performance clauses have been broken, they have no choice but to get rid of him, then maybe if Cadillac comes in and says, hey, Checo, why don't you come over here for a couple of seasons? We'll give you a nice way to bow out of F1 on your own terms, then I think Checo would take it. And also, I think it would certainly be a very popular move in the American region, and I certainly think that it would mean that once Checo did choose to retire, all of his fans would look to this Cadillac team quite warmly because they gave him a home and they allowed him to end his Formula One career gracefully instead of being sacked. And what also might be welcome is Alpine's surprise Brazil form being more sustainable for the future. And whilst they're about to lose work status, Oliver Oakes' other racing outfit Hi-Tech could be a good bet in Team Ensign's life after Renault. To find out why I think this team will last this really high profile transition and maybe come out of it for the better without Renault overseeing them and pulling the strings, watch this video next straight after this one.